Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair, and to the final week of Classic Novel Month 5. This year, we've looked at a story from an author that we've looked at before, 2 books with famous twists, so what are we going to use to close off the year? Allow me to explain with a story. When I was a kid, I was a pretty voracious reader. I was always reading, so naturally I got a lot of books as presents. The person who gave me the most books was my grandmother on my mom's side. She was always buying me those kid versions of classics, like The Prince and the Pauper and David Copperfield. Side note, if I ever review David Copperfield, do I have a story about what happened to my original copy. Back in the first classic novel month, when I came up with the idea, I picked out 2 Mark Twain books to close off the month. Not because of any bias towards him, I didn't love his stories any more than any of the other authors I looked at, but because one of the books that my grandmother had bought me when I was a kid was this collected edition of 3 classics: Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and a 3rd book that I'll get to later. But I couldn't find the book. It had been so long since I had read it that it was buried in the back of a storage room and was inaccessible. This past January, though, I cleaned out that storage room and managed to find it. And as you can see, the 3rd book I mentioned was Moby Dick. A book that, despite it having been in this collected edition that features 2 books that I've read cover to cover multiple times, I've never read. Shocking, right? It's just that I was never really interested in reading it, and then I misplaced the book, so I never got around to reading it. And so I figured, what better way to end Classic Novel Month than with the final book from the collection that was supposed to end the first Classic Novel Month. So, without further ado, let's look at Moby Dick. The cover is, well, we've got 2 covers to look at. The one from the edition that I initially owned, which I try to always look at if possible, and then there's the one from the edition I got for the review, the original unabridged book. The abridged American Classics for Children from Dalmatian Press features bits from the covers of the 3 books that it collects, which features the faces of Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, and Captain Ahab, smirking in front of a whitewashed fence, Jim on a raft on the Mississippi River, and the white whale, respectively. And it's pretty damn striking. I like how, despite the fact that it's just paper, they made the collection look like it was bound in actual material, and I like the blue color. While I never read this version, I did look at it an awful lot as I contemplated reading it, so I wanted to look at it. Plus, I had intended looking at the cover back when I did Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, so this is just me fulfilling a promise that I made to myself. The cover for the unabridged edition is also rather striking as well, with the damaged ship in the background while the guys in the smaller boat in the foreground are near a big whale. It's interesting, but part of me feels like it might have been just a painting that was appropriated for use as a cover, like how Caspar David Friedrich's Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog has been appropriated for use as a cover for Frankenstein, despite it having no connection to it. I can't find anything to say that's also the case for Moby Dick, but it's just my hypothesis. It's Moby Dick, so you're not really buying it on the merit of the cover, so let's get to the story. The story revolves around our main character, Ishmael, as he tells us to call him in the opening sentence, as he goes off in search of adventure. He ships out as a sailor rather than a passenger, since the sailors tend to have more adventure, and because it's cheaper. He initially goes out for a position with this crazy captain and his first mate looking for some place called Candied Island, but he settles for a whaling venture out of Nantucket. He ends up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and misses the ferry for Nantucket, so he has to spend a few nights in New Bedford before the ferry comes back, which means that he's got to find a cheap place to crash. He finds the Spouter Inn, which seems great, except he has to share a bed with another patron, Queequeg, a Polynesian harpooner covered in strange tattoos who carries a tomahawk. Man, Airbnb in the 19th century was really weird. Queequeg doesn't know about the arrangement because he's out selling shrunken heads, so when he comes back and finds Ishmael in his bed, he is justifiably a little pissed off and brandishes his weapon, as Ishmael shouts for the innkeeper, who explains the whole situation, and the two of them manage to sleep through the night. Ishmael and Queequeg head off for Nantucket, and they both get jobs on board the Pequod, captained by Captain Ahab, though they are warned by a man that they'll be doomed if they go with him. I'm willing to bet he's like Captain Future from that story we looked at last summer. They're introduced to the crew, which includes Starbuck. Not that one. Not that one either. And then they finally get to meet Captain Ahab, whose entire deal is getting revenge on the white whale that cost him his leg. And that's pretty much the basic plot of the book. Ishmael goes off on the voyage on the Pequod, sailing around the world as Ahab hunts down his greatest enemy. They sail around and do whaling things, Queequeg gets sick but recovers, and then we finally get to the meat of the novel, Ahab's final confrontation with the white whale. They head after it, with Ahab even refusing to help another ship locate lost crew, finding several ships left destroyed in Moby Dick's wake. They go down, and their boats are destroyed, and Starbuck even confronts him. But much like the characters that Ahab would go on to inspire, he's not listening to reason and keeps at it. Eventually, after days of fighting, Moby Dick destroys all the boats and the Pequod, with all hands going down with it, except Ishmael, who managed to not get back to the ship in time and so ends up as the only survivor, floating on what was supposed to be Queequeg's coffin until another ship shows up to rescue him, ending the novel. We'll be right back with more of the show. And did you know that Herman Melville lived next door to another famous classic novelist? I'll tell you who after these messages. We're back, and Melville's famous neighbor was none other than Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter. Melville also dedicated Moby Dick to Hawthorne. I'll let you interpret that however you'd like. The characters are pretty solid. I mean, we've got Ishmael, our narrator, who seems a little bit too worldly to be going around whaling. I mean, hell, his exposition is so knowledgeable that you'd almost think that Melville was trying to show off his research skills, though he's not entirely central to the story. He's the conduit in which we experience it, but he's absent for huge swaths of the book, whenever Ahab goes into soliloquy mode, and Queequeg is interesting too. I can't figure out if he's racist or not, because he's like a vague sort of Polynesian, maybe African, maybe also Native American mix, but he's honestly one of the best characters in the book. I mean, his introduction in the story is finding Ishmael in his bed, and then proceeding to threaten him with a tomahawk, which later turned out to be a fancy pipe, but I mean, you could scream. You could call the innkeeper, but he goes straight for the weapon. He is awesome. Though I did find it a little weird that he and Ishmael became such fast friends. It's not like they shared that bed for weeks. They shared it for one night and were already like two teenage girls, telling secrets and talking. Starbuck, a man of faith, is the voice of reason for Ahab, telling him that he's suicidal and questioning his judgment. But of course Ahab doesn't listen to him, and so everyone still ends up dead. Speaking of Ahab, he's exactly what you know him to be from pop culture. He's the crazed captain who wants the white whale and will do absolutely anything to achieve his goals. He's like an ancient Greek hero. He's ultimately a good man, but unfortunately bad things just keep happening to him. He loses his leg and decides to crusade to destroy all evil. And according to him, all evil is contained within a white sperm whale. My God, Linkara was wrong. The true evil in the world isn't ancient Egypt, it's white whales! But yeah, he's crazy. But at least his heart's in the right place. And I feel like we should talk about Moby Dick, even though he's not really a character in the sense of having a personality and such. He's basically Jaws. He shows up to wreak havoc and kill people, but not much else. His entire deal is in his symbolism for what he stands for, which is, as far as I can tell, a metaphor for God or something. Dear God, this book is a slog. It is probably the slowest paced book that I have ever read. I mean, Ishmael just goes on and on and on, and we haven't even gotten to the whale yet. It's all his own backstory, and honestly, I don't really care about his backstory, at least not at the very beginning, when I open the book and I'm expecting a white whale, and from hell's heart I stab at thee. Ishmael just goes on and on and on about his backstory, and I'm sorry, all he had to say was, I like to be a sailor because it was fun. Here's a story about when I became a whaler and met this insane revenge-driven captain. And admittedly, part of my problem is the language used is different from how we speak today, so it's also pretty damn confusing. I mean, I always start reading the books in mid to late May, so I started with this one first, and I just couldn't get through it. I had to put it off to the side so I could read the other books, but in total, I think it took me about 2 weeks total to do Planet of the Apes and Fight Club, and this one I was still reading as I was writing the script. Hell, I might even still be reading it while I'm filming. I'm not, by the way. But still, I know that it gets interesting once we meet Ahab, but do you want to know how far into the book that is? 100 pages until we get to the chapter titled Ahab. But it might as well have been 1,000 because that's what it feels like. Anyway, the novel is mainly driven by revenge once it gets to the Ahab stuff, but it gets bogged down in a lot of the exposition, and I suppose that this is how novels probably were back then, and based on a lot of classics, like Don Quixote, that's probably the case. But geez, it's like a Lord of the Rings novel. The narrator gets sidetracked talking about whaling, and I get that I need to know about whaling to appreciate the book, but I don't need 6 pages talking about it. Just give me a brief summary, damn it. What I'm trying to say is that I feel like a lot of stuff could have been cut, and we'd get the same story with all of the same power, but with less weight. The revenge stuff to me is pretty stock, but that's because of how much of a classic this is. Nearly every revenge story in fiction nowadays, Star Trek II, that frankly weird episode of The Flash with the turtle, Obsession and the Doomsday Machine from the original Star Trek, Futurama, Peter Pan, and Star Trek First Contact feature references to Moby Dick, usually in the form of direct quoting. Wow, Star Trek fell back on Moby Dick a lot. There's a reason that one of Khan's most famous lines is a direct rip from the book. It's stock because I've seen it done so many other places, but it's really cool to see the original and how it's similar and how it differs from what it inspired. The book is a classic, and the themes and motifs are fantastic. The problem is that the book is dense as shit. I know as a book reviewer I shouldn't condone it, but I swear I would never have made it through this review if I didn't have SparkNotes open on my computer to explain what the hell I'd just read in every chapter. It's so dense and the language is so esoteric. Maybe it's the edition I read, but I had a hell of a lot of trouble with this book. It almost became my white whale, ironically enough, but I soldiered through and managed to finish it. I recommend it, but that comes with a bit of a warning. This book is no easy task. You need to be able to handle the language, the density of the story itself, and the fact that the exposition bogs it down so much that it's a slow start, and that can turn a lot of people off. If you can make it through all that, I recommend it. If not, check out the movie starring Gregory Peck. And that was Moby Dick. Was it good? Yes and no. It's good in the sense of it being a good story with good characters and good action, when there is action, but it loses some points because of how long it is, and there's a lot of dead weight that, like when a boat is sinking, should be jettisoned to help keep it afloat. It's a great book, but it's not an easy read, and I can't say that I'll be giving it another read anytime in the near future. And that was Classic Novel Month 5, the final read tier. It's been a great 5 years of doing Classic Novel Month, and I'm happy that I was able to give some love to some of the classics that usually get tossed to the side when the school bells ring. Thank you all for joining me for this final year, and I hope you'll come back next year for some other theme month. I'll probably do a poll next year to see what type of theme month, but I've got some ideas floating around in my head. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the Literary Lair, you can hit that subscribe button, and if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. See you next time for a video I wish I didn't have to make. See you then.
What's 2 plus 2?
Richard Basehart?